Welcome to everyone. I am Eric Rougier. I'm the organizer of this webinar, and I will be also the moderator. Today, we have the great pleasure to welcome as special guest, Professor Dani Rodrik. Thank you very much, Professor, for your time. Professor Dani Rodrik, you are the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard's John Fitzgerald Kennedy School of Government. You are an economist whose research revolves around globalization, economic growth and development, and political economy. Your current work focuses on how to create more inclusive economies in developed and developing society. We are going to present your new book on shared prosperity in a fractured world, a new economics for the middle class, a global poll on our climate. Professor Eric Rougier from the University of Bordeaux and the Bordeaux Schools of Economics will be your discussant. You will have then 5 minutes to respond to him if necessary before to open the Q&A session. Thank you very much, Professor, for accepting our invitation. This webinar takes place in the frame of the research program selected and funded by the University of Bordeaux, France, and the IDEX, Understanding Human Wellbeing and Behavior for Better Policies and Societies, the HOPE program, led by Professor Olivier Barguin, and in the frame of the Bordeaux Schools of Economics. Now, Professor Jean-Marc Figuet, Director of the Bordeaux Schools of Economics, will take the floor.
Thank you, Loic. It's a great honor for the Bordeaux School of Economics to welcome Professor Dani Rodrik today. He's one of the world's leading economists and a key voice on globalization, inequality, and development. His work has profoundly shaped debates on how to build fairer and stronger economies. We are delighted to have him with us today to discuss his new book. Thank you so much, Professor Rodrik. I'll let you the floor now.
Thank you very much, Professor Figuet. Thank you, Loic, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you, albeit remotely. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about my new book. Let me see if I can get it to show up on the screen. Let's see. I take it that you can see it?
Yes, we can see it. No problem.
Great. Okay. So this book came out a few months ago, and it's an attempt to make myself feel more cheerful and more optimistic about our future than perhaps we have any reason to realistically believe at this moment. But if I'm able to leave you a little bit more optimistic than you started at the top of the hour, I'll consider it a success. Now, I'm addressing in this book what I think are the three most significant economic challenges of our time. The question of our green transition and how do we address climate change? How do we rebuild social cohesion and restore the strength of our middle class through increasing the quantity and access of good jobs? Because I believe that's fundamental to the strength of not just our economies, but our societies and our politics. And finally, even if we're sitting in advanced countries as a moral imperative, how do we continue on a path of poverty reduction and resume on a period when, in fact, we had significant successes through what has been accomplished in China and other countries in Asia, but now under circumstances that look very, very different. Now, there are many reasons to believe that those three objectives might, in fact, be incompatible. many of our existing policy frameworks, and in fact, the way in which our leading policymakers and politicians talk about these problems seem to suggest that there are severe trade-offs. That on the one hand, these challenges, and in particular that of addressing climate change, requires significant amount of global cooperation, global governance, and yet quite obviously global cooperation has always been in short supply, and we're moving definitely into a world where national sovereignty will reassert itself to an even greater extent, and global cooperation will be even in more scarce supply than before. There's, of course, an old, long-standing debate about whether we can address our climate transition without hurting possibilities of economic growth, particularly in the developing world, but also in the advanced countries. And also in recent years, an apparent trade-off, if we listen to our policymakers, both in Europe and in the United States, that if we're going to bring good jobs back and increase employment opportunities as a path towards a healthy middle class, that might entail trade policies, a certain amount of protectionism, and attempts to reshore manufacturing back home. And of course, that would seem to lie at odds with the needs of many developing countries for a more open trade regime. This idea, of course, has been taken furthest in Trump's America, but I think it also runs through much of the discourse in places like France, where there is an important discussion about reinvigorating manufacturing as a source of good jobs, particularly in regions that have been left behind. Now, what I want to do is push back against the pessimism that arises from these apparent tensions. And I do so by suggesting that, in fact, in the context of our, our changed global economic and technological landscape, that there are ways in which we can avoid these trade-offs. Probably one of the most important ways, and I think here China has led the way, and I think it's very important that we learn that lesson from China, that there's a very strong growth and developmental logic to the green transition, that in fact, especially green industrial policies can be used as a way both to advance the climate transition and also to lay the stage for productive technological transformation to enhance growth. And I want to spend a little bit of time on that because I think the lessons are important both for the climate transition, but also in general, for what I call a kind of a productivist approach to economic development, which focuses on the importance of a collaboration between the state and the private sector to productively upgrade the economy and engineer structural change, of which green industrial policies in China are, I think, a premier example. Second, and I think very important, is that I don't think we have sufficiently internalized that manufacturing are no longer the future of our economies when it comes to jobs and employment. That when we have no choice but to consider services, many of which are non-traded, as where the jobs of the future are going to be. And if we recognize that reality, it calls for very different types of industrial policies or productivist policies that are focused on generating good jobs and services. And that agenda is one that inherently entails fewer trade-offs with the interest of developing countries or a reasonably open world economy, because most of the interventions, most of the public policies will focus on services that are largely non-traded. And so there's a kind of a domestic agenda that does not significantly overlap with trade policies per se. And in both of those axes, whether it is the green transition or the creation of good jobs through services, what I do in the book is advocate a common type of policy, if you will, updated industrial policies, partly informed by the experience of China, but also the experience of many advanced countries as well, that we have learned from the conduct of these industrial policies. And these are not top-down command policies and purely based on subsidies, as we often think about industrial policies. They're much more collaborative, iterative, and depend on a wider range of policy instruments. And all of that against a context which I call sort of, taking after a quote from Avinash Dixit, who once said, "The world is second best at best," that we need to work against an environment where, we often, for political or for lack of global cooperation, that we cannot approach these policies from first best angle, but often second best can take us actually quite a bit far. And that's the reason for my fundamental relative optimism. But of course, the question is this realistic, or is this just utopian? So a lot of the book is actually trying to show that these ideas build on practices that already exist, and that we have examples to build on. Now, the one area where, in fact, this argument, in some sense, is the strongest and is the most significant is with respect to the green transition. Now, we have experienced in the last decade or so an incredible revolution in renewables, where the price of solar, wind, and now electric vehicles and batteries have been reduced to a point where, in fact, it's much cheaper to generate energy and power from renewables than it is from fossil fuels for in a lot of contexts and a lot of places and for a lot of uses. To the point, and I think this is important to, it's difficult to overstate the significance of this, that many of the harshest critics of our existing climate policies and our reticence or reluctance to move on this front, such as, a very well-known name in the United States is Bill McKibben, who was one of the earliest people to ring alarm bells about climate change, are now sort of sounding actually quite optimistic about our future, and saying that this renewables revolution is the first thing that's happened in 40 years that begins to look like something that could actually reverse our path and save us from the course that we were in. And where is this coming from? How did we get this renewable revolution? It's actually through something that was not at all what people were thinking about when we were thinking about climate transition, because our focus was largely on global cooperation, was largely on carbon taxing or cap and trade equivalently. But instead, this has happened through industrial policies, particularly in China. Of course, China is not the first country to have engaged in pushing for new technologies in renewables. Actually, it was first Europe and the United States that led the way, but they sort of receded after a while. And 10 or 15 years ago, China made a big push into this domain. And thanks to a variety of Chinese industrial policies, about which I'll say a couple of words in a second, and the presence of both very strong learning effects and also what appear to be empirically demonstrated evidence for spillovers from investments in renewables, that we've entered a world in which a virtuous cycle of support for renewables leading to capacity, leading to learning by doing, and spillovers resulting in cost reduction and price reduction and expanding the markets, and a kind of a virtuous cycle of significant reduction in the cost of renewables. And China has done this in ways that are, largely orthogonal to what one might have thought about sort of East Asian top-down industrial policy. It is true that this was taken on as a national project enunciated from Beijing with the objectives of the Communist Party. But this was a highly experimental policy with demonstration cities, demonstration zones, enabling localities to engage in a variety of different policies. Even though we focus a lot on subsidies, the policies used went far beyond subsidies, engaging in changes in regulation, public investment, R&D. At the local level, very significantly, the use of public venture capital to support startups and new technologies. And at all levels, it has involved very close collaboration between the government agencies and the private sector and the entrepreneurs. And in typical experimentalist fashion, there's been a variety of feedback loops and mechanisms of iteration and revision in policies to change policies over time. So far from being a kind of top-down, centrally planned type of policy, this has been much more, in the words of one analyst, a kind of the Chinese government acting as a collaborative catalyst to make this revolution happen. Now, we know that, of course, industrial policies, and certainly green industrial policies, don't always work, and there are also things that we can learn from the failures. If the Chinese example teaches us the virtues of an experimentalist approach, I think there are examples such as the infamous example of Solyndra in the United States. We can learn from the downsides of trying to focus too much on individual firms and individual successes, rather than sort of trying to create a portfolio of experiments and treating this in a way that recognizes that some experiments are not going to work out. What I want to highlight in this comparison, though, is that I think what sets the West apart from China in the conduct of industrial policy is not regime type in the sense of democracy versus authoritarianism, that in many ways the state in China has acted in the way that in the United States, for example, the DARPA regime works, in the way that the United States has fomented high technology that has produced the internet, the GPS, and many of our other key technologies of our day. In many ways, this is very much the same kind of experimental approach in fostering new technologies. Now, so I think what this experience with green industrial policies show both the benefits of a second best kind of an approach that uses more the carrots of incentives rather than the sticks of taxes and cap and trade and curbing emissions, with a much more favorable political economy attached to it. It also suggests a style of policymaking, again, what I call productivism, which is closely collaborative and iterative, focused on productive upgrading and structural transformation. And the question really, when we turn to other domains in that sort of trifecta of objectives, whether it is strengthening the middle class and enhancing good jobs or fostering development in the developing countries, whether there's an equivalent of those green industrial policies in those other domains. So in the remainder of my time, I want to talk a little bit about how some of these same approach that have been so successful in the green transition can also be used to foster new activities, new technologies, new types of organization to promote good jobs for the middle class and for more cohesive societies and healthy democracies. Let me begin by underscoring the importance of jobs and good jobs, because I think conventional economics significantly downplays the importance of jobs. Now, I think this is a professional deformation that's specific to economists, because I think non-economists have known for a long time, whether sociologists, social psychologists, understand the importance of jobs both to our individual well-being and also to a community's health. But I think there are sort of at least three different respects in which we have failed as economists to take on board the importance of jobs. One is simply what it does to our, to our life satisfaction, or what we might call in economics jargon utility, that actually work enters your utility functions negatively in the way that we specify preferences. But of course, that runs counter to everything that we know from how people feel about the way that they participate in work, and how they view their jobs as part of their identity, part of their social recognition, part of their personal dignity and esteem. And we know that from studies of life satisfaction or happiness, that job loss is associated with very large and persistent drops in life satisfaction that actually cannot be undone simply by compensation and transfers. And I think that's a point that economists often miss. I think the second point is that going beyond individual well-being, that job loss, when factories disappear as a result of technological shocks, austerity, trade shocks, that the community as a whole suffers. So there are significant externalities, social externalities associated with job loss, that communities that experience joblessness also suffer from various social ills, broken families, higher rates of crime, increased rates of addiction and mortality, and ultimately, especially important in our day, support for authoritarian populists. And finally, from the standpoint of social justice, I think focusing on jobs also leads us to consider a different conception of social justice than what economists typically focus on, which is distributive justice, the question of who gets what. That when we understand that jobs are important for both individuals and their communities in a specific way, that we can discuss social justice also in terms of what Michael Sandel, my colleague at Harvard, has called contributive justice. That is the opportunity to win the social recognition and esteem that go with producing what others needs and value. And so that calls for approaches that go simply beyond redistribution and compensation and transfers, and calls for us to create directly those opportunities with which people can, through their jobs or otherwise, contribute to society. Now, the second question here is where will those jobs, where are we going to be creating those jobs? Where do we have to focus if we're going to have a good jobs agenda? And I think here, policymakers have not sufficiently internalized the fact that the jobs are no longer in manufacturing, and that's going to be less and less the case. Now, I show here some of the leading advanced countries. In the United States today, jobs in manufacturing are sort of, less than around 8% of total non-farm employment. It's remarkable in the United States now we've had 3 administrations, Trump 1 and then Biden and now Trump 2, which have made manufacturing and manufacturing jobs a cornerstone of their economic policy. Now, they've gone about it in very different ways, but it didn't matter that in all 3 administrations, jobs in manufacturing continued to slide down. It seems nothing that you did would actually have made a difference. I think the situation in Europe is pretty similar. I think there are some differences across countries. You see France there, the blue line, which actually has experienced some of the sharpest drops in employment in manufacturing relative to total employment in Europe. But I think really what sets France from some of the other countries like Italy or Germany apart is less the drop in employment, which has been in common across all these European countries, but more sort of where they started out from, that Germany and Italy have always had a larger share of jobs in manufacturing, but there too are experiencing significant reductions in the share of employment in manufacturing. Now, one might say, well, this doesn't reflect what the results could be of a more aggressive attempt at creating jobs in manufacturing, that maybe we didn't go about it the right way, and who are simply much more serious about reinvigorating manufacturing and reshoring supply chains and so forth, that could increase ultimately jobs. I think probably the strongest argument as to why that's unrealistic is to look at China itself. After all, China, which is the country that you would turn to want to emulate when it comes to manufacturing, because China has been increasing its footprint in manufacturing, output and exports, is the undisputed powerhouse in manufacturing. But now for more than a decade, China has actually been losing jobs in manufacturing at a very significant pace. China has lost more workers in manufacturing in the last 10 years or so than the total number of jobs that exist in Germany and the United States taken together. So we're talking about tens of millions of jobs. And of course, what explained this is this big disconnect now between output and employment in manufacturing, thanks to automation, robots, and other forms of technology that have been employed, which are highly labor displacing. You can succeed in reshoring manufacturing. You can increase manufacturing output, but paradoxically, what you will need to do to become competitive in those areas is precisely the kinds of things that will ensure that you're not creating a lot of jobs in manufacturing. So the reality is that the jobs of the future are in a lot of sectors that are a lot less sexy. And when we talk about productivity, industrial policy, are sectors that we do not talk about. There are sectors like care, like food service workers, people in retail, customer service representatives, janitors and cleaners. So these are the 10 largest occupations according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections for the next 10 years. And what stands out in these for these occupations is, of course, that they're largely low wage, undesirable jobs. And they don't require, so they're not tradable. They're not like manufacturing. And also that 8 out of 10 of these categories don't actually require university degrees. So the challenge before us is really how to engage in a productive upgrading of these occupations, where the bulk of the jobs are going to be, without resorting to sort of blanket recommendations like just increase education, increase access to university, or simply strengthen your manufacturing. So that's, I think, is the critical challenge. Now, if we are going to make those jobs in services, food, retail, care, those sectors, good jobs, and a basis for a future middle class, I think part of it will have to do with ensuring that workers in those sectors have voice, there's collective bargaining, that their rights are being protected. But ultimately, as we know from the experience within manufacturing itself, is that what makes a good job ultimately, sustainably a good job, is higher levels of productivity. And therefore we'll need to worry about whether it's possible to increase productivity in services, which traditionally have suffered from what's called as Baumol's disease, which is it's very difficult to increase productivity historically in services. Now, again, in the last 10 years or so, some of the evidence points in a more optimistic direction. We have actually experienced in the United States, I don't know if the data for Europe, but certainly in the United States, we've experienced significant increases in labor productivity in areas like wholesale trade, retail trade, accommodation and food services. In fact, in all of these areas, productivity growth has actually outstripped productivity growth in manufacturing. And when you think about how that has happened, well, think about platforms, or think about Amazon, or think about restaurants that are able to use QR codes or sort of online ordering in order to increase the productivity. Now, that hasn't always come about that's not always produced higher quality of service as in restaurants, or certainly has not contributed much to higher quality of jobs in the way that the deployment of these technologies have typically been controlled by the employers themselves. But I think it suggests that it is possible to enhance productivity growth in services that we have traditionally considered as essentially being quite stagnant in that way. So here the question then becomes, so what might a program of productivity growth in services, in labor-absorbing services look like? I think there are sort of two legs to a program that focuses a kind of an industrial policy for labor-absorbing services. One, I think, would be a highly local and experimental approach, since much of these jobs are basically provided through small and medium-sized enterprises, and conditions on the ground differ are very contextual. I think a lot of that would have to be built on existing local development coalitions and programs. And I think just as in China, municipalities and localities have been a hub for experimentation for green industrial policies, we can build on different regions and localities and existing cross-sectoral collaborations on how to essentially create good jobs, support small and medium-sized enterprises. There are examples of this happening when localities get their act together, coordinating services, redefining a vision for the future. And under Biden administration, actually, there was a very interesting experiment of that kind. There were under the Build Back Better program, there were regional challenges where the Biden administration made some funds available for different localities to compete for these funds, to essentially put forward-looking agendas for how they would essentially revitalize the regions. And that kind of a partnership between localities and the national government that fosters, encourages both experimentation with different approaches, as well as local cross-sectoral collaboration between business groups, workforce training, local universities and community colleges, and so forth, I think is exactly the kind of example that has demonstrated success on which one needs to build. But I think it requires much more dedicated effort on the part of national government to provide more resources, and also requires us to understand that these experiments have to go beyond simply subsidies and efforts to attract investment, but to what Tim Partek and others have called provision of customized public inputs that range from coordinated services to very specialized workforce training, to management extension services, to provision of technology, greenfields, and so forth. And the process of figuring out which one of these combinations are required is part of the process of collaboration and learning. The second, I think, very important tool, and here I think there is even a bigger role for national governments, and in Europe for the European Union, for Brussels, is really to understand that technology has a direction, and that we need to actively engage in promoting technology that's going to be labor friendly. I think this is particularly useful for AI. I think AI has the potential to increase the agency autonomy of less skilled, less experienced workers in occupations like care, essentially providing them with the knowledge and experience of much more skilled professionals. But I think we need to engage in the development of those technological tools, because I don't think the private sector and business on its own is going to do it. Again, here we can build on existing experiments that we already have, such as the Buurtzorg system, the Dutch neighborhood care system that is very decentralized and works along these lines, as an example. So let me just conclude. I may have gone a little bit over my time. That essentially all these three challenges are challenges that take the form of how do we undertake structural transformation. And I think our instrument for that is going to be kind of an updated industrial policy that builds on what we've learned on the conduct of industrial policy. And I think in many ways that reduces the demand for global cooperation and global governance, because a lot of what I've described to you and these experiments essentially are run at the national and local level. And these are the kinds of successful examples on which we can build and can achieve something without necessarily bemoaning the lack of global cooperation or the weakness of international institutions. So let me just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rodrik. Thank you very much for respecting your time. It's very appreciated. Now I give immediately the floor to Professor Eric Rougier in order to react to your presentation. Professor Rougier, you have around 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for this presentation, Professor Rodrik. So thank you, Loic, and thank you all the colleagues for having organized this very important webinar for around this book, which is highly contributive to, let's say, both making a synthesis of what we know today about these complex links between globalization and domestic economies and domestic polities too. And also important for the policy implications of the books, which are part of the main contribution of the books. So the books as first contribution, let's say, the first one is to articulate 3 diagnostics on the current state of the world economy and national polities, north and south. So this is what is interesting is that what is relevant for the north is very often also relevant for the south. So I like this symmetry of the issues and also the symmetry of the solutions, policy solutions. This is not common in the literature. And so it creates a very convincing narrative that Professor Rodrik has recalled in the beginning of his presentation. So hyperglobalization is retreating. It's becoming increasingly a zero-sum game. The biggest players always win. The central challenge in both rich and developing countries is the same. So the sectors generating productivity gains are globally dominated by the big players, and they don't absorb enough labor domestically. And the political consequence is what we see everywhere. So in the global north, polarization, resentment, populism, and in the global south, growing appeal for the Chinese way and democracy losing ground, to be brief. And from this articulated diagnostic, the book's second and probably most decisive contribution is to advocate 3 radical policy shifts described against real-world success stories. So this is deeply illustrated. And again, equally relevant for both North and South. So the first one is that globalization's benefits were probably overstated, and the benefits of policies, pro-globalization policies, were probably overstated. And the fact that good national policies create global prosperity, not the standardized ones, the one-size-fits-all ones. The second policy shift is that new policies must target demand and supply bottlenecks all together in an integrated way to generate good jobs, especially in the non-traded services. And the third one is that policymaking needs local, experimental, and scalable solutions, and not top-down or one-size-fits-all approaches. So these are 3 very important policy shifts to me. So the book progresses very cleverly, articulating these diagnostics and their policy implications in a very, very convincing way. And for whoever knows the Professor Rodrik works, it's fascinating to see how most of his contributions in the past 25 years, so gross diagnostics, trilemmas, institutional diversity, second-best policies, etc., are articulated in a narrative highly consistent and highly relevant for our current times. So this is impressive. In the end, the combination of systemic understanding and policy HOPE demonstrated by the book makes this work relevant and insightful well beyond academia, and notably to policymakers and hopefully to all stakeholders of this productive transformation that is called for. So I've struggled. So to say the truth, the book is so dense that I've struggled a lot to find a limited number of points on which I wanted to have a discussion. So I will limit my points to the global north, and it will probably need another session to discuss the challenges and stakes for the global south. And it's a paradox because I'm myself a development economist. But I think the issues for the global north, it's the world in which we live, we are currently living, so they are very important. They might be of more interest for the audience today. So my first point is on the services solution, which is one of the central theses of your book. So you suggest that services could become the new engine of mass employment and prosperity. That's a compelling idea, of course, but it's probably worth questioning ourselves, notably on the conditions under which this analogy holds, especially with AI reshaping the economy, as you recalled in your presentation today. In fact, the challenge is maybe the following. So manufacturing thrived because people always wanted more cars, fridges, and other goods, but services, they look a bit different. So there are the high-tech services like finance, IT, which have a big potential for providing good jobs to the middle class, but they don't create so many jobs and they face global competition. And the other, the labor-intensive services, the ones on which you insist, like care, food, transport, etc., they face big hurdles in terms of expansion potential. So they have an income elasticity which is lower than the manufacturing goods, for example. They are mainly driven by needs, for example, like care. And plus, the wages are generally lower initially, and workers in these sectors, they often lack bargaining power for claiming better conditions. So this raises two questions which are strategic in your proposition to me. So if the services that could create more good jobs are the ones most at risk of saturation and low wages, how can we make this their expansion sustained and compatible with the ambitious objectives of good jobs? Is it all about productivity increasing, or how to avoid downgrading the skills and diplomas of the middle classes instead of upgrading non-traded bad jobs in good jobs? This is a balance to find, because there is a risk that the former will happen. It's easier to downgrade to let the market downgrade the middle class skills and diplomas rather than upgrading the bad jobs into good jobs. Do we need legal protections or incentives for nudging the markets in doing this? So in going to the layer solutions. And there is a second related question, which is how can we make their expansion fiscally sustainable, especially if it means more public spending or more subsidies? So the numbers are stubborn, and such the policy packages are used as the one you describe. They rely on big public investments. So this is the same for the green transition. And this cost, we don't know if they are related. Let's say policy projects, I wonder if they are realistic and if they are given today's budget constraints in the US, but also in Europe, or could we make them more compatible? So this is something I would like to hear you on. The second point is on my second point is on democracy, the middle class, and polarized system. First, about democracy and what I will call the speed dilemma. Many countries, they are moving beyond the hyper-globalization today successfully, and like China, for example, and US is trying to, but it's too soon to decide if it succeeded or not. But this country, they tend to be a country where democratic constraints are weakening. China is the clearest example, but there is the same process in the US, where, let's say, democratic processes tend to be more and more considered as obstacles to speed, coordination, and technological leadership, especially by the AI sector. This fuels a troubling, a very, let's say, worrying narrative. So authoritarian systems may be better at delivering rapid structural change than democracies, yet your book is optimistic on that, and it argues that democracy is not just compatible with prosperity and sustainability, but it is essential for durable success, and notably through this productivist, let's say, program. So my question is, how can democracies reconcile the need for speed and the strategic direction with the realities of pluralism and accountability? So this is not easy to let's say, figure out how they can do. And maybe the book push forward for subsidiarity, decentralization in policy making. So is it the solution you have in mind? Does it also require more local democracy, or is it compatible with more centralized model of democracy? So, and maybe more provocatively, what concrete institutional innovations could help democracies stay competitive with authoritarian systems in this respect, without sacrificing the core principles of these democracies? Maybe I will. Okay. I will jump to the third point, so I will forget the middle classes. One decisive challenge that emerged from your presentation, and which is absent from the book, but is artificial intelligence. But it can be understood because it goes so fast that when you wrote the book, I guess that you didn't imagine the challenge of the AI on jobs that we foresee today. So my question is that so this challenge may be the deepest one for your let's say policy program, and the decisive question is whether artificial intelligence undermine or not or on the contrary, why not enables the productivist paradigm? So I wanted to hear you on that, and more specifically, the core question is: do you think AI is a labor-friendly technique for services, or will it destroy more jobs than it creates? So it's very difficult to answer this, but I'm curious to know your take on that. And on both, so it raises two questions of feasibility, in fact, and I will finish my discussion with these 2 points. One is economic, and the second is political. And these two feasibility are highly conditional on the answer to the core question I just asked about the fact that AI is or not a labor-friendly tech for services. So the first economic feasibility issue is that if AI sharply rises productivity but not employment and not good jobs, gains will accrue to capital, not labor, and this could deepen inequality, weaken demand, general demand, and undermine the very middle class purchasing power that your productivist agenda seeks to build. And then it will undermine the coalition also. And politically, what would the supporting coalition, this is my last one, what will the supporting coalition of the productivist policy project look like if AI really disrupts middle-skilled jobs before good job infrastructure is in place? So what will it be? What will its true agency be in these conditions? Thank you very much for this very, very interesting and very thought-provocative book. I would say as always, because I'm a constant reader and quoter of your work, Professor Rodrik. So I was very enthused to have the chance to read this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much, Professor Rougier, for your reactions on your questions. There are a lot of questions to Professor Rodrik, so it's quite challenging to respond to everything. But Professor Rodrik, you can react to the reaction.
The right to pick up
from Professor Rougier. Yes, you can pick up the questions during these 5 minutes for responding to the questions. Thank you.
No, thank you, Eric. I think those were really, really big and important questions, and so I really appreciate them, and there's no way that I can do justice to them. Very quickly, let me just telescope some answers. On the fiscal dimension, I mean, I just want to say one thing that's part of the focus on productivity is precisely that we can't just support the expansion of care and other sort of services just purely by paying through the public system and without running into fiscal problems. So we'll need to figure out how to make that those things by increasing the quality. For example, when you improve the quality of care, actually you give some of the lowest paid care workers more importance. You increase their agency, you increase the kinds of tasks that they can do beyond, the very narrow things that they're typically assigned to do. One of the, huge benefits you get is you actually get that kind of, translates into better care, that translates into, fewer emergency room visits, lower incidence of chronic disease, sort of the things that are very costly for the public health system. And so I think, the problem is that part of the productivity benefits don't necessarily accrue directly to the care providers. And therefore, there are huge externalities here in terms of who's reaping the productivity benefits. But I think that's part of the focus on productivity is really to ensure that you're not simply you're improving the quality of service and without having to necessarily increase putting more and more money into the system. The second dimension about fiscal is that I want people not to immediately think about subsidies when we're talking about the state trying to increase productivity through productivist policies. That in care especially, much of this will be through reorganization of the care system, rather than simply putting traditional subsidization of various types of activities. So those are the two things I think to avert the fiscal constraint is focus on productivity. Second, don't necessarily think of productivist policies purely as subsidies. The question about democracy versus authoritarian, I'm a great believer that that's not a relevant question. I mean, if we can get benevolent autocrats, we'll always go with them. The problem is that, we cannot rely that the autocrats will be always benevolent. I think, I do think democracy manages some of these tensions, although we're living in a moment where it's very difficult to say lots of good things about democracies. But yes, I think decentralization is part of it. And I think, especially in the context of Europe, I think Europe has to foster much more experimentation at the national and subnational level, that I think that our mindset has moved much more towards harmonization of approaches and common rules and so forth, that I think is discouraging or reducing the incentives for national and subnational, especially national leaders, I would say, to engage in policy experimentation in areas like industrial policy. So yes, I think decentralization is part of the answer. What the center has the advantage is center has the resources. So I think a partnership between resources from the center and experimentation at the local level, I think, is the general recipe. Finally, maybe say just a word about AI, whether AI is labor friendly or not. I think there's a big difference with AI than earlier technologies like automation. Automation was very much sort of an enemy of labor because it directly replaced labor, displaced labor. AI in principle, is not that, because it gives labor the skills and experience of those that are more experienced and more educated, and that has the potential of AI. So I think if we're able to deploy it appropriately, I think it should be an advantage. But the big question, of course, is whether we can deploy it appropriately, and what's the respective role of private corporations and in the US and governments in reaching that. I think I think we need to urgently change the public conversation and narrative around AI from what will AI do to us to what do we want AI to do for us. And unfortunately, we're not there. I think we're still thinking as a kind of, AI is something that falls on our lap. I think, that we urgently need to change direction there. But there is a potential that potentially is quite possible, positive, although I don't discount your worries at all.
Thank you very much, Professor Rodrik, for your reaction. Thank you very much, Professor Rougier, for accepting to be the discussant. That was very nice to hear you both. Now, the floor is to the audience. We have 5 minutes remaining. So I would like to know if we can take the first range of questions from the room. from the in-person audience. Who wants to? Nicolas? So Professor Nicolas Hérault is going to ask you one questions.
Thank you for the talk. You were mentioning Michael Sandel, and I very much liked his book, like the Tyranny of Merit, and I was wondering if you share his views about free trade, which I think the book opened my mind on the fact that perhaps we've been really focusing too much on customers, and so the gains that you get from free trade by having lower prices overall versus the effect on jobs and employment. And I guess now we know, thanks to the work of David Autor and others, that this job loss can be concentrated in some places where obviously what people are going to gain by having lower prices on imports is not going to offset the job losses. So yeah, my question is, like, would you share that view that we should reconsider our view of free trade and not have this unique focus on customers and lower prices and consider jobs as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do think that we have, I mean, I think for a long time we just told ourselves that we're just getting the benefits of cheaper prices, you know, the Walmart effect and all of that. But I think that was a very, very partial view, and we underestimated the. So how do you manage trade policy in that context is a big question. I mean, again, my preference is to not lean on trade restrictions per se, because they're very, you know, they're a very blunt instrument for what it is that you're trying to achieve, which is to create jobs and economic opportunity. So I think the more direct industrial policies, place-based policies, the type of productivist policies I'm focusing on are much better, because you're trying to directly create those job opportunities. Rather than sort of acting to trade barriers. But sometimes, you know, trade barriers can be, you know, slowing down liberalization or maintaining slow to moderate trade barriers is kind of second best measure, while others, you know, play their, you know, where you're trying to ramp up your other policies. I think that might make sense. So I don't think we should be doctrinaire against the use of trade restrictions in the way that we used to be.
Thank you very much for your response. Professor Tanguy Bernard, who is online, would like to ask you a question. Tanguy, you have the floor.
Hi. Sorry, I put it in the chats already, and I wasn't. Maybe it could have been kept for later. But thanks for the very clear and nice presentation. I haven't yet read the book, Dani, so sorry if this is a bit not relevant. But so given the large substantial heterogeneity in demographic dynamics, with Africa being essentially the powerhouse of youth in the years to come, and pretty much all the other regions on the decline, how is that affecting the story in a way? I mean, does it mean that if there is free labor flow, which I don't think that's exactly what we're seeing these days, I mean, politically, we can all convert towards a unified sort of strategy. But if there's not, that does mean a diverging economic strategy across regions. And so I was just wondering how that fits in the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about Africa in the book. I didn't have time to talk about it here. But I mean, oddly, I think there's a convergence, because, you know, I make the argument that even in low-income Africa, I think it's very unrealistic to expect sort of replication of the export-oriented industrialization model as in East Asia to be the main vehicle through which you're absorbing this, you know, tens of millions of very young workers in urban areas. And differently so that also calls for a focus on services in low-income countries, just like in the advanced countries. Of course, the structure of, firm size structure and employment structure is very different. In low-income countries, we're really sort of informal employments, micro-enterprises, self-owned, that's really, the big area where I think, we need to focus on the kinds of strategies. And there are examples of whether you're, organizing street vendors and providing them technology to shorten the supply chain, or using platforms to expand the possibilities of gig work in sort of urban areas in Africa, or forming partnership with large platforms like ride-sharing platforms to expand their source of drivers, employment. So there are a variety of different strategies for creating employment. It's not going to be the kind of very glamorous jobs like IT or BPO, but it's going to be better than what vast majority of jobs are. So I think that's the kind of strategy that I'm advocating. It's not going to produce the kind of growth rates that East Asia got, because generating growth through sort of broad-based services strategy doesn't generate that much of a growth. But the advantage is that it's a much more broad-based strategy, so it's less top-down, it's more inclusive and more bottom-up. So I think the quality of that kind of services growth, trying to create your own middle class, I think the quality of that growth is better than the quality of top-down growth. So I think that's the kind of trade-off, and that's the silver lining of the services-based, labor-absorbing services-based model for low-income countries.
Thank you very much for your responses, dear Professor Rodrik. Now it's the time to end this webinar. Thank you very much again for your time, for accepting to be with us. It was a great pleasure to listen to you. It was very dense. We would like to continue to discuss with you, but time is time. So now it's the moment to leave the webinar. Thank you very much, Professor Rodrik. We keep in touch, and we hope to see you soon. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Luc. Thanks
Bye-bye.
again.
Thank you very much.
And thanks, everybody. Thank you for, bye-bye.